It is a blessing and an honor for Sarah and I to be joining you from the States. And, before I jump in this morning, I just want to thank Maggie, not only as a social worker and someone who cares deeply about families and communities, but as a mother who tries to be very diligent about how I raise my children. I just found such affirmation and yet also challenges and encouragement in what Maggie shared. So I appreciate that so much. And I could tell by all of you that you were deeply encouraged and I think challenged as well as what Maggie had to share with us today. I was scribbling some notes as Maggie spoke, and I thought this is a great bridge to what I have to talk about today. What it takes to survive. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. But I loved that Maggie also talked about the importance of story. And I know that as a mother. I know that as a person who is deeply involved in advocacy. Stories are meaningful. They shape our identity. They connect us to our past. They build our bridges to our future. But yet we all know that in our culture, whether we're here in New Zealand, we're in Australia, we're in the States, there is definitely a movement for only certain stories to be known, certain stories to be heard. And so as I share today, I am going to share parts of my story because that's how I became involved in the pro-life movement and why I want to talk about how we make abortion unthinkable and how you can continue to stay the course and find hope. But I hope that as I speak about this, you think about the power of narrative on the issue of abortion and how it has led us to being where we are in our world, but also look at that as an opportunity of how we can continue to move forward. Yes, there are always challenges in our world and certainly in social conservatism. But as we look at obstacles, we also need to look at the hope that is to be found as we tackle those obstacles. I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about my story.
I am the survivor of what our world would say is a failed abortion. I'm alive today because an abortion attempt in 1977 failed to end my life. That day I was meant to be delivered as a quote-unquote successful abortion, otherwise known as a deceased child. That is now the day that I celebrate as my birthday. The day that I was accidentally born alive. I didn't know my story, though, until I was 14 years old. And that day changed my life forever. When I first found out my story at the age of 14, I felt incredibly alone. Over time, I found out that there was one other abortion survivor, and that was Gianna Jessen, and that changed my life. Fast forward over a decade, and I was actually speaking at the March for Life in Canada at the time. And I'll never forget, this young man approached me after the march, and he kind of whispered to me. He said, I'm one of you. I will never forget where we were standing when that conversation occurred. I will never forget him. That really opened my eyes to the fact that not only was I not alone, but people like me are everywhere. We know through statistics from the CDC that they were identifying 400 to 500 live births a year after failed abortions. If we do the math, that becomes 17,855 survivors. I'm on this mission to find those 17,855 other abortion survivors, to heal them, empower them, equip them to find and use their voice. And at the same time, finding and serving those 17,855 families who have been impacted by a failed abortion. Through the Abortion Survivors Network, we've connected with 403 other abortion survivors from 18 different countries, and they range in age from infants to 89 years old. The overarching goal is we want the world to recognize that every human being is more than a choice. And so in 2012, we became an organization. and really started to put out survivor stories, even if it was anonymously, and kind of becoming that first place that was really starting to put that messaging out about failed abortions and survivors. I really kept looking around and saying, why hasn't anybody done something about this? And then I realized in 2019, it's been me all along. And so that's when we became a nonprofit. In the middle of the pandemic in 2020, we started offering community groups that brought in survivors from all around the world. We've healed, we've empowered them with relationships that further that healing, and then we've equipped them by training them to be public speakers, giving them coaching, helping them understand what it's like to advocate and be involved in the pro-life movement. And then we've given them a platform that's safe and credible to then use their voices. You know, I'm so blessed to be alive. I'm so blessed to be a wife and a mother. I'm blessed to be a leader in the pro-life movement. But I can tell you my greatest blessing comes in knowing my fellow community of abortion survivors and creating a place for them in our culture where they're healed, empowered, and equipped, where we're raising their voices for the first time in over 49 years of legalized abortion. Every single survivor's voice is powerful, but the voices of survivors together, that's what changes our world, politically and in families and in individual lives. I know that as we raise their voices, we're not only going to change their lives and we're changing families, but we're going to change our culture.
And that's my encouragement. Where there is life, there is always hope. And already today, I would like for you to just look around the room for a moment and think to yourself, how many abortion survivors are in this room? You heard me say in that video that we're everywhere. I can tell you that I'm not the only one in this room. And isn't that an important question when people are making quote unquote decisions about abortion? For them to truly sit and think, who in this room may have actually survived an abortion? I can tell you that it changes people's perception when they start to think about that. And yes, every time I show up, and I talked about this last night, whether it's the Parliament in Australia or being in Ireland, right? Going and testifying before the Senate in the United States, just because someone doesn't treat me with respect and acknowledge my humanity doesn't mean that they don't hear me. You know what I mean? So we show up, we raise our voices, we share our stories, and I think of it as planting a seed. We don't know when that seed is going to grow. Other people come along and water it. But I can tell you that those lives make an incredible difference. And I think yet today you're going to get to know of at least another survivor who is here in the room. Some of the things I want to talk about today, I don't have enough time that I want to share everything that I wish I could with you, but I want to share some key concepts with you. And these are really timeless. It doesn't matter that, as we talk about in the video, Roe versus Wade, we know that since that video was shot, Roe versus Wade was overturned in the United States, something that we celebrate, but it didn't change the battle for life. In many ways, it heated it up. We used to have one common goal we were working towards in the United States, and then when that happened, it's like a bomb went off, and the shrapnel went everywhere. And now we're trying to pick up the pieces of the shrapnel time and time again as the battlefield keeps shifting. But the reality about the truth about life remains. And so I'm going to talk about some terminology so people can even understand who an abortion survivor is. I said this to someone last night. You know, I love when, especially politicians, right, on the other side will say, well, abortion survivors don't exist. What I hope that you can say to them is, do you know who an abortion survivor really is? Do you know what that experience actually entails? Please don't tell me that they don't exist if you have never listened to them, if you don't know what those experiences involve. So we're going to talk about some terminology, how often it happens, a little bit about the recommendations Sarah and I have about reporting, because this is not a political issue. This is a human rights issue. In my opinion, the greatest human rights issue that we face globally. But we know that those numbers have power. Voices have power and data has power. So I'm going to talk about some reporting that we recommend and also what the gaps are that we can see. Because these are things that aren't just germane to us that we tackle. These are all pieces that you can know about and start having conversations about time and time again. So some of the basic terminology, and I know this seems very simple, but an abortion survivor is just quite simply someone who survived an attempt to end their life. Period, end of sentence. And this happens in so many different ways. So this is someone who survives a surgical abortion, someone who survives a chemical abortion. It can be someone who survives an at-home attempt to abort them. In various places around the world, we see people ingesting a lot of chemicals. We saw this before Roe versus Wade in the United States. We see it recommended now by the abortion lobby time and time again. Do your own abortion, right? DIY. You can do this at home. Nobody has to know about it. As Maggie is talking about what our young people encounter, I can tell you our team sees all the time what is coming out on social media when it comes to abortion. So this is still being pushed still today. We see lots of instances where babies survive abortion pill reversal, so those are survivors as well. And we see instances where the process is started and a woman can stop it. We also see cases of twins. We hear this quite frequently when an abortion isn't successful and there are multiple attempts to abort, which I'll talk a little bit about today. In those kind of instances, when doctors look at those records, they do believe that there was likely multiple babies in utero, and so the abortion takes the life of one child, but not the other one. And abortionists just don't perform adequate exams. And in today's world, they aren't being given exams, right, as women have early medical abortions. And so they aren't even aware of how many children are in utero when they are performing these abortions. So I want to talk about failed abortions first, and I'm going to share a little bit about my story with all of you, even though you heard a little bit about it in the video. So there are many of us who survive failed abortions. Up there on the screen, you see my friend Claire Colwell. She's from the States as well. Her twin was successfully dismembered in an abortion. Her biological mom was 13 years old when her family forced her to have an abortion. And that's a lengthy story. You can actually look that one up online. But the abortionist had no idea that Claire's teenage mother was carrying twins. And so she could remember seeing the child's body parts. And like so many women, left that abortion clinic in great pain, believing that the abortion had been successful, which it was for one child, but they had no idea that she was carrying Claire. So Claire ultimately survived the procedure that took her twin's life. And yet there was great pressure for her mother to abort again, but this young teenage woman stood strong and carried Claire. And no woman should have to fight in the way that Claire's mother did. But this is the reality of so many women. Up there on the screen, you see a couple of our survivors who are public with their stories. They survived at-home attempts to abort them. And this gets really interesting when we talk about abortion survivors and their stories, because if we don't know people's stories and hold them with great dignity and value and share them, then we are continuing to perpetuate the secrecy and the shame and allowing the other side to successfully dehumanize. So that's part of why it's so important to me that I educate you about who all of us are, not just me, because this isn't just me. The other side would love to say that, right? Oh, there's just one of you. Well, if there is just one of me, I still add dignity and value. But when there are a multitude of us, then that should tell us a lot about the humanity of every preborn child. A little bit about my story as we talk about failed abortions. As you heard in the video, I mean, I'll age myself quickly. Some of you did the math already, right? I'll be 47 this year. It's okay. My kids think I'm ancient, so I have a nearly 10-year-old and I have a 16-year-old. And I loved in Maggie's slides, my kids know I know what I'm talking about. And they still think I'm cool most of the time. Some days it's a tough one at my house, but I think they play along with it. And, you know, the reality is my children never would have lived if that abortion would have succeeded in taking my life. And if my kids were here today, they wish they were, but if they were here, they would tell you the impact that abortion has on generations. And for me, that's part of the discourse that we need to have about abortion, is that it doesn't just impact one person's life. It impacts a multitude and for generations to come. My birth mother was 19 years old when she was forced to have a saline infusion abortion. You know, when I recently testified before the Senate in the United States, I did not share much of my story. I shared a different one. But as I spoke that day, I could watch the aides kind of shuffling. And at one point, they brought forward a piece of paper and said, "We want to make it clear that saline abortions aren't performed routinely anymore." We know what that meant, right? Dismiss her. She is not relevant to this conversation on abortion. And that is the message that we get. But I like to remind them, I will always be relevant to the conversation when abortion is still happening. That saline infusion abortion, thank you. It happens to all of us when we stand up and we speak out. That saline infusion abortion that was forced upon my birth mother, Ruth, was the most common one performed back then. It isn't performed routinely anymore. They're correct about that. Not because it's a horrific procedure to women and children. That is indeed true. But the reason why they stopped performing it is because it had such a high failure rate. Too many of us as babies survived that procedure. And so they had to find much more effective ways to ensure that abortion succeeded. And isn't that interesting? When they want to talk about it being healthcare, when a healthcare procedure isn't successful, it results in a live person being born. Confusing, isn't it? But that procedure was a horrific one, and not just to me, but to my biological mother. I now know through my medical records that my birth mother endured a 5-day-long abortion. Longer than the standards of that procedure. It should have lasted about 72 hours. That procedure involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding me in the womb. And of course, the intent of it was to end my life. So the child would soak in this poisonous, toxic solution, being poisoned and scalded from the outside in. And after their life was successfully ended by that solution, they would induce labor with the intent of that deceased child being expelled from the womb. When we talk about born alive infants, this is what most people think about. And that is a reality that, yes, circumstances of surviving a late-term abortion still happen. We also hear that a lot. That doesn't happen. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. We just don't want to acknowledge that. But back then, that was a reality for babies like me. When my birth mother's labor was finally induced successfully, that's what took so long. I'm stubborn. It's so, right? Yeah, thank you for the round of applause. I am grateful, right? God gave me a very particular constitution. I can't deny that. But of course, they believed that the abortion would be successful. It should have been. It took longer. They started to believe my birth mother was going to lose her life as well in that abortion because it was taking so long. And on the 5th day, when they finally induced her labor, I was expelled from the womb. Imagine how shocked they were that day. What makes my story very dramatic for a lot of people is how personal it really is. The person who forced the abortion on my birth mother is someone who should have protected her, shown her unconditional love. The person who demanded that the nurses leave me to die when I was born alive should have seen my humanity, should have been a grandparent that Maggie talked about, who could have brought life into me. But instead, it was my maternal grandmother who was responsible for all of those things. I think it would be fascinating, Maggie, if we looked at the stories of grandparents and the dynamics of families and truly asked hard questions like, what is the history of abortion in the family? To know why some of the dynamics exist the way that they do, because I see it in my work. And, you know, I wish I could stand here today and tell you that after that day, I know that my grandmother had a change of heart and a great conversion, but I will never know that. What I do know is that my abortionist left the next day. And as far as I can tell, he never performed another abortion after that day. And my truest hope has always been that somehow my grandmother did ask for forgiveness at some point in her life. I don't know that I will ever know that, but I have hope that she knew Jesus. And I have hope that my birth mother can somehow be reconciled to her family someday. Families are forever changed by abortion. It forever changed the path and the trajectory of my birth mother's family. But my birth mother is now a huge part of my life. Not all survivors are adoptees. Most of us are actually raised in our biological families. We were talking a little bit about that last night. It's fascinating to people. But I want you to know that because I want you to understand the depths to which there are secrets surrounding abortion in so many families. Women carry their babies to term after attempting an abortion. Who are they telling about it? Do we know it as medical professionals? Do we know it as social workers? Do we know it in our schools? It's a lot, isn't it, when you start to think about it? My birth mother and I connected when I was about 37 years old, so she's now been a part of my life for about 10 years. What makes our story very dramatic is not only that I survived her abortion, but that she lived for over 30 years of her life believing the abortion had been successful. My adoptive parents had no idea. They had no idea the role that her family played in it. They had no idea that when I was rushed off to the NICU after surviving that abortion at probably 31 weeks gestation, weighing a little less than 3 pounds, they had no idea that my grandmother followed the nurses to the NICU and said, "Don't ever tell my daughter that this baby survived." Everything we know about how abortion impacts someone physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, I will tell you, Ruth walked through that. And God has been so good to us. You know, as we talk about making abortion unthinkable and also really how we stay the course and have hope, I hope after today you remember not just my story, but Ruth's as well. Because God has been so steadfast in my life to survive an abortion, be quote unquote perfectly healthy today. Yes, right? I have my own little idiosyncrasies. Trust me, that's a whole nother story. But I'm alive. And there is always hope to be found in that. But I have been so blessed because my oldest daughter was born at the same hospital where my life was supposed to end. And trust me, I told God I would never do that. And God always has this way of having the last laugh with me. I don't know if anybody else can relate to that, right? Every day I'm like, uh-oh. Our daughter was born at that same hospital. I lived in the same city as my biological father for a period of time, and I ultimately ended up moving to Kansas City, which is now my home, not knowing that that is where my birth mother, Ruth, lives. God has redeemed and restored and reconciled so much in my life. And there is so much hope to be found in that. But that's what I always want people to understand is if I had not survived, those things never would have happened in Ruth's life and in her family. And so I'm grateful to be a small part of that for her. I want to talk to you about how a woman often finds out her abortion has failed, because we get those questions a lot, right? People go, how does this happen? Well, we can't always even explain how an abortion fails, except it doesn't, right? Either they aren't performing an adequate exam or God intervenes, right? We know this. Abortion pills fail, all of these things, right? Abortions fail. But then the question is, well, how does a woman even know she's still pregnant? In a case like mine, right, there was no gap of time. I was born in the final step of that abortion procedure, and it was late term. But what we need to understand is, especially in today's world, women are having early medical abortions and finding out very early on that they're still pregnant. We find many women keep this a secret. They also don't understand for quite a long time that they're pregnant. right? They're not told that this is going to happen. They're told this is going to take care of your problem. You can go on with your life. So imagine a woman takes the abortion pills. I shared this testimony recently with the US Senate. A woman named Evelyn was covered in the Washington Post recently. She took a round of chemical abortion pills. As the weeks turned into months, she realized that she had not gotten her period again. And so she went, and she had a friend of the family. They arranged for her to have blood testing done at a hospital and then an ultrasound. And in this article, the Washington Post, a very liberal publication, they even shared she passed out for a period of time when she saw the heartbeat. Can you imagine? But you know what the next thing that happened was? She then took another round of abortion pills. But put yourself in Evelyn's shoes. She's scared. She hadn't told her parents, right? She was young. She hadn't told them that she was pregnant. She's shocked that the abortion pills failed. The abortion industry and the media, social media, everywhere you go, if that is discussed, they say, come back in. Take another round of abortion pills. P.S. You don't want to have that baby. What have you done to them? So many women carry such shame and guilt and fear over what have I done to my baby, that therefore abortion is then pushed again. In Evelyn's case that I shared before the Senate recently, she did take another round of abortion pills that were shipped to her from India. And she knew almost immediately that she wasn't experiencing the side effects that she was expecting. She was still pregnant. So as you see on the screen, right, women have a lot of physical symptoms. They might notice they're still gaining weight, right? They aren't having their menstrual cycle return. They often will go for a follow-up medical appointment, but that's why pregnancy care centers are so important, and good hospital professionals who are pro-life and can come alongside someone in a time of very shock, right? And support them. That's also why we exist at the Abortion Survivors Network, is to provide answers to these women and say, you know what, you're not the only one going through this. We can connect you with other women worldwide who are going through this. And P.S., we want to give you hope that your baby can be okay and that we are not going to leave your side. You don't have to navigate this journey alone. It's such a shameful experience for women and families going through it. And we want to cut through the shame and be supportive of them. But you can see, right, that ultrasound also provides us this great window and support to a woman who is questioning, right, what have I done to my baby? What is their life going to look like? Should I have another abortion? And I want to be clear, an ultrasound doesn't allay all of a woman's fears after her abortion fails. Those fears remain, even after the baby is born. But we can kind of look at that continuum of life and say, okay, we've gotten you to this place, right? You have this information. Now we can get you to this next spot, right? There is always hope along this journey. So we also see that there are another way that abortion survivors come into this world. And this is one that is not talked about often in the pro-life movement, and that's a stopped abortion. That is when a woman literally will stop her abortion, typically because of the amount of pain she's in. Maybe there's distress. I talk about one of those stories in my Abortion Survivors Break Their Silence book. A woman was having a late-term abortion and felt like she heard God talking to her saying, get up off the table. And of course, that was not what the abortionist and the nurses wanted. And yes, are there physical risks to a woman when she stops her abortion and for the baby? Absolutely. But those can be medically monitored. And I always am clear with people, there are no guarantees for anyone. You know, as someone who has given birth to 2 children and lost one by miscarriage, I know that there is never a guarantee for my child. But I need someone to stand beside me in that and be honest about it. And that's what these women need as well when they stop their abortion. We also see stopped abortions happening when, say, they start an abortion procedure and they find out that the woman is much further along in the pregnancy and they actually can't complete the procedure the way that they would at that gestation. So this is one of those stories.
When I was 18 years old, I found myself pregnant. I never viewed the baby as a human. I viewed the baby just as a problem. Just thought that, the sooner I get rid of the problem, the better, and the easier it will be to go on with my life. When I found out I was pregnant, I was about 8 weeks pregnant. I planned to go to Tulsa to get an abortion. My best friend from high school drove up. I had an address, I had an appointment, and we headed out. And whatever address we went to the wrong address. There was no abortion clinic. So we had to find a payphone and call the clinic to say, hey, where are you? As it turned out, they were on the opposite side of town. There was no way that we could get there in my allotted appointment time. So it was a case of, sorry, you're gonna have to reschedule and come back. I went back to Fayetteville, Arkansas, dejected, upset, and rescheduled for the following week. My same best friend came and drove me to Tulsa, and we did go to the correct clinic. They did abortions to 12 weeks in Oklahoma at the time. And at the time, I should have been about 10 weeks pregnant. When they did the ultrasound, I was over 12 weeks. So they turned me down. They wouldn't do the abortion. Defeated once again. So I went back to Fayetteville. I knew that I could get an abortion in Little Rock up to 15 weeks. So I made an appointment. Another friend from high school was going to drive me. My boyfriend at the time, William, agreed to drive me to where she lived. For some unexplained reason, the night that he was driving me, it was so foggy that we couldn't even see the lines on the road. Of course, I was so determined to have an abortion. It finally reached the point where we couldn't continue. It wasn't safe. And so we went back to Fayetteville, and my friend agreed to pick me up the next morning and then drive to Little Rock. First thing they did was an ultrasound. I measured 15.3 weeks. Defeated again. We had no choice, but to turn around and go back. Mission not accomplished. It just seemed so obvious that something larger than myself was controlling what was happening. The clinic in Little Rock told me that I could go to Dallas, Texas, and that they did abortions to 20 weeks. I went to 2 clinics in Dallas. The first one, they did abortions to 20 weeks. They did an ultrasound. I measured 21.6 weeks. The numbers did not align with how pregnant I was. I had a meltdown in the clinic. They gave me another address and sent me to a second clinic that did abortions to 22 weeks. I knew that if I left there and went to the next clinic, it wouldn't happen. And so I confirmed, can I take this ultrasound with me? Will they accept this? Because if there's another ultrasound done, I'm out of luck, like always. They called, they set it up, they said they would accept that ultrasound. So we headed to the second clinic. Instead of doing an ultrasound, they basically started the procedure. They inserted the laminaria, and my friend and I went back to her sister's house. I had been so determined to have the abortion that I never considered the humanity of it, or the loss of it, or the reality of what was happening. I was just hell-bent on eliminating the problem. At the same time, William wouldn't leave me alone that night. He was calling constantly, trying to talk me out of having the abortion. I was hurting and scared. Around midnight, I finally told him, if you'll come to Dallas and be with me, then I'm 95% sure I won't have the abortion. And he got up at 4 a.m. and drove to Dallas to meet me at the clinic. So when I got off the elevator. He was standing there. And he went with me into the doctor's office, and I told him that I had changed my mind. And he told me that there was a very good chance that at this point I would miscarry anyway. I made the decision to put the baby up for adoption. On July 26, 1982, very early in the morning, I woke up in the middle of the night and everything was wrong. Bill and Jana, the couple that I was living with, I went into their bedroom and woke Jana up and told her that something's not right. And so she told me that we needed to go to the hospital. She was born at 8:23 in the morning. She was 13 weeks premature. One of the nurses asked if I'd like to see her. I said yes. And when I saw her, I knew I couldn't give her up. But at the same time, I didn't have a plan. Bill and Jana were a young married couple at the time with 2 small children. Bill and Jana saw a need. They gave themselves. They gave their home. They made their lives uncertain because of me, a stranger. They were the no judgment zone. William and I did end up getting married, and we have 2 other children, and we put the abortion capers in a box and set it high on the shelf, and it wasn't something we talked about. Lauren came home from college. We had never told her any of this. I can only explain it as it's one of the few times in my life that I knew that God was speaking to me. I knew that I had to go home and tell Lauren her story. So I went home and we went into her room and shut the door, and I told her the same story. I told her, I don't know why, but I know that God wants me to tell you this. And we never meant for it to be a secret. How ironic is that? The baby that I rejected, I was worried about her rejecting me. I told her, I don't see myself ever telling this story, but you have my permission to tell it because I just don't feel like I can. It's like all of those feelings that are inside that box on the shelf, it exploded. Looking back on it now, there was a lot of trauma involved. I can't imagine the trauma that would be there if you had actually had an abortion. I'm only beginning to deal with my own guilt and shame that I didn't even know I had. But when I pulled the box off the shelf and opened it, it exposed all of that crud inside. It's taken 40 years for me to realize that stuffing it all away, it has totally impacted my life. That baby that, I fought to get rid of and then fought to keep, I love her so much. And I can't imagine life without her. I see her kids and think if I had gotten what I wanted, then they wouldn't be here. Lauren's the one that made me a mom.
There's a lot to unpack in that video, and maybe you can write down questions that you have for later in the day, but I don't think there's a better way for me to help share about the impact of a failed abortion and a stopped abortion on a woman, quite like the way Karen shares their story. And there are so many miracles that happen there, and I think her words of wisdom are so powerful that I think they'll resonate with you even after today. You can hear more of Karen's story and her daughter Lauren's perspective on that by visiting our website, abortionsurvivors.org. We have a YouTube channel that is full of survivor stories. So you can learn more about how diverse they are and share them with other people. I have about 5 minutes left with all of you this morning, and I want to talk a little bit about another category of survivors, and then really talk about the incidents and then the gaps in reporting so that you can understand why we don't have as much knowledge about this as we'd like to, and how we can all go forward and be a part of that conversation. So those are some of the survivors of stopped abortions. You'll see her daughter Lauren up there. So what you caught, even in Kieran's language, is she doesn't even really know how to talk about stopping her abortion, right? That might be a little bit confusing to you when she said, you know, I told William, if you come, I won't have this abortion. What she meant was, I will not follow through with the next step of the abortion. The next step of the abortion would have been that Lauren would have been dismembered. That's what that really meant. But think about that. When we don't understand it and have the terminology and have this conversation, then women like Karen and survivors like Lauren don't even know how to talk about it, right? They don't know what this means in their life. And for me, that is a great injustice to women and to survivors and families, that they aren't even able to understand what has happened to them, nonetheless be accepted into the world and have the opportunity to be supported and have a voice. We also see survivors of reversed abortions. We know that abortion pill reversal gets criticized time and time again by the abortion industry and their lobby, trying to convince people that it's dangerous. One of my favorite organizations to follow is APLOG out of the United States. Those are pro-life obstetricians and gynecologists, and they speak great truth into that sphere. So if you haven't followed them, they do incredible work to talk about abortion pill reversal using progesterone. Those are just a handful of survivors that we see worldwide who survive successful abortion pill reversal. So how often does it happen? Far more often than anybody wants to talk about. As you see in that quote from the Philadelphia Inquirer back in 1981, even that head of surveillance for the Centers for Disease Control talked about that, right? Well, I mean, why would you want people to know, right? It needs to be hushed up. We don't want the public to know. What would happen if the public knew? Gosh, maybe we would know what abortion is and what needs to be done to restrict how it is ending lives and harming people and families and our culture. So they don't want us to know. What we know statistically through the Centers for Disease Control in the United States is that they were reporting 400 to 500 live births a year. That's what they would talk about. That's how you saw that number that I talked about in the video. But that is very much a low ball estimate. If the CDC is going to tell me 400 to 500, I'm going to know it's much, much higher than that. You know, sadly, we know by looking at death certificates for babies who survived abortions, how long these babies also live. For me, I live every day knowing that I would have been one of those statistics. How long would I have continued to live? I was nearly dead after I was laid aside at the hospital and not immediately provided medical care. But we're often told that abortion survivors are simply incompatible with life, that that's why the abortion happened in the first place. I'm going to tell you that's not what we find in our population of survivors. These are elective abortions, and yet they are very much compatible with life. We know through statistics in Canada, some in Australia as well. I have great respect for the fact that I can get statistics out of Canada and Australia. We know that those are a couple of the countries that report out their survivors. But again, there are huge gaps in reporting. And certainly when we don't even know how many early medical abortions take place, we certainly don't know how many babies are surviving them. A couple of statistics to throw out to you as I close. When we look at the Canadian data, we find routinely about a 0.21% failure rate of abortions in Canada. Realize that does not include chemical abortions or at-home attempts to abort a child. But we see similar numbers in Australia as well. It looks at about 0.21% failure rate. Chemical abortions actually have an even higher failure rate the longer gestationally a woman is taking those abortion pills. When you reach the 10-week mark, the failure rate increases and continues to increase throughout that pregnancy. So meta-analysis of chemical abortions shows routinely anywhere from a little over a 1% to almost an 8% failure rate. but I've seen reports of even higher statistics, say in the 20% range. But realize when there aren't adequate exams, people are obtaining them at home, they don't know how far along they are. This is the perfect storm for a woman to experience an abortion failing and for a survivor to ultimately come of that. But then it begs the question, how do we know? Do these women know where to get help? Do they know that there is hope? We should all have a lot of questions about that. As I close, some of the other statistics that I want to talk about are actually important ones. So I want to talk in closure, first of all, about how a woman feels. You heard this in Kieran's voice, right? She was shocked. She was scared. She felt guilt and shame, right? There's sadness and grief. They feel alone, disappointed. Guys, this is where it's hard not to judge someone like Kieran, but I'm going to ask you to do that. When you hear her speak, I know it's very hard to hear her words, but she didn't get what she was expecting. So we need to acknowledge that she is told that this is going to fix her problems. We see that there's anger, there's shame and guilt, as I said, there's anxiety, there's so much fear. But it doesn't just impact that woman who experienced that, it impacts the family. Families need support. And I can tell you that when we aren't identifying this, we aren't serving survivors, we aren't serving mothers, we aren't serving men, we aren't serving families. And if we don't break that cycle in a family, there is abuse, there is neglect for generations to come. Talk about the power of a story. Stories ultimately set us free if we are willing to do the hard work and find healing and support, right? And we start a new cycle in a family. But this is very much a family issue. In closure, what I want to talk about is some of our concerns in reporting, because I know that we have some former members of parliament or parliamentarians that are here. You know, there are concerns that we have, very much so, in the number of survivors. We know that there are a lot of issues when it comes to chemical abortions. So some of the concerns we have, right, these obstacles are ultimately opportunities. There's a lack of consistent reporting in every nation on abortion and those chemical abortion reporting numbers. We should all be deeply concerned about that for women's health and for those survivors. We also know in research that there are a lot of folks who are lost to follow-up. So they don't know what happens to these women after they've had a chemical abortion fail. If we aren't curious, we're never going to find the answer. So I think we need to be curious. It isn't a bad thing. We also know that Born Alive legislation doesn't address the fact that there are babies surviving these early medical abortions. We don't know how often it's happening. We don't know if medical professionals are made aware. I would tell you that I find most of the times they don't know. And those women deserve medical care. Those survivors deserve medical teams to be prepared for what they might be born with. That should be included in their medical record, because they should be treated throughout their lifetime for what may come of that. It also becomes an identity issue for us. If these things are kept a secret and not documented, then we question who we are and whether there is something deeply flawed within us. If you can't even write about it, then there must be something wrong with me. That's the message that we get. We also know that those babies who survive a chemical abortion are at greater risk of more abortions being completed against them. That is the reality of today's brave new world on abortion. So we need to be asking these questions and finding some answers. And of course, the last concern is that mothers, survivors, and families aren't being identified and those outcomes being addressed. No matter how people feel about the issue of abortion, I would like them all to come alongside us and agree that survivors and mothers and families deserve support and the best outcomes we can offer to someone even after an abortion has been performed. During the Q&A today, we can talk more about this, but there are some great resources out there. If this is something I often say I nerd out about this stuff. I nerd out about data and how we can support people in better ways, but you can look through a lot of research and what other doctors recommend when it comes to identifying how often this happens and how we can support people in a time of need. But the two top points would be, we need to be reporting the number of chemical abortions that fail and result in a continued pregnancy. And we also need to have a reporting system of birth defects as a result of that. Again, that should just be a standard practice that I would encourage people to come alongside us and work on together. And for me, that's my final point. That's where I find hope, right? If God can spare my life and put me on a journey to healing myself and healing my family, I ultimately got to become curious and strong enough to ask the questions so that I could be here today and encourage you to come alongside me, no matter where we are in the world, and not only save lives together, but be willing to have those hard conversations that create lasting change. Thank you so much for being here today, and Bob, for everything you've done.